Welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. Here's your host, Tom Bourne.
Hi, and welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. I'm your host, Tom Bourne, and with me today is the lovely Karina Bourne. Karina, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Tom. How are you going?
I'm doing well. Now, I brought you on today to talk about your experiences in the early childhood profession. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the profession, your current position, and what led you into those roles?
So currently I am a consultant on a mental health initiative for education, so from birth to 18. And I support learning communities in learning about mental health and building their mental health capacity for themselves, for children and for families in their community.
Okay.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing that?
A couple of years now, like 2.5, 3 years.
And before that?
So I've worked in early childhood pretty much my whole career, starting when I was about, I think, 16, cleaning a childcare centre, and then started doing relief work. And from there, worked part-time and did some nannying, and then back into early childhood, took some time off to have a child, did my university degree. So I have a Bachelor in Education, specialising in early childhood education and care. And went to work in long daycare. I've worked in long daycare. I've worked in family daycare as a coordinator and as an educator. I've done some training and assessing in early childhood qualifications. So a bit of all sorts of things, really. But it's a great profession to be able to do lots of different things and to really explore what it is that you want to do.
Okay. What was the initial spark to head down that pathway?
Oh, it just happened, really. I think I've always had a natural affinity with children. And I think you can see that in lots of my family. There's dad's always coached and things, and it really just happened. But then it became a really conscious choice to be part of that sector and to work within it and to advocate for early childhood as a whole.
And you haven't really deviated out of the profession since you first started working, have you?
Not really. I think I went and had a break and worked for 6 months in a copy centre, and I hated every second of it. And then went back. But I think it was when I was kind of in between nannying and working in like the learning communities. And I think it really showed me that working isolated wasn't what I wanted to do, or wasn't right for me at that time. And working as a part of a team was really important. So that's why I went into kind of more of a centre-based care.
Okay. Of all the roles that you've been in the profession, what's the greatest challenge you've faced across the whole profession?
I think there's lots of different challenges in different ways in any role. I think in some roles there's a lot of systemic issues. So if you're thinking about long day care and the problems that we're facing around staff shortages and some of those issues is really a systemic issue that's quite hard to challenge, and that can be really challenging. I think the fact that people don't see early childhood as a profession and don't value it as much as what should happen, in my opinion. I think that if we think about my qualifications, I have the same qualification as a teacher working in a primary or secondary school, but I've chosen to work in early childhood, and I've chosen a lot to work with infants and toddlers because that's my passion. But it's not seen as that. It's seen as not as valued as teaching as a whole. So that, I think that's a real big challenge in itself.
Glorified babysitting, that's what I've heard it's called by some people.
Not my favourite term, as you can tell. We have lots of lengthy conversations around that.
Yeah. What is needed, in your opinion, to shift shift the belief that the profession is actually a profession, that it's not just a child-minding service?
I think there's lots of things, and I think it's the way we advocate for ourselves. So I consider myself an early childhood professional. I use the word educator or teacher, and I'm not afraid to use that, using terms such as children, referring to the sector as a profession, because it's really needs to be seen as that. And I think if we're advocating that for ourselves, then that is turning a little bit. I think over COVID, a lot of people have seen the value of early childhood a lot more, and how much is involved in educating and teaching and caring for children. I think there's still a long way to go, but I think particularly parents have seen it as a really needed space, and how it is integral into our communities. And I think that's turned a little bit, but I think we need to have high standards of qualifications. We need to have a lot more of that being advocated for. But I think that comes down to the fact that it's known as a very low paying role. It's a very, it's not seen as something that, I didn't go into early childhood thinking I was going to earn lots of money, let's say that way. It's something you do for a passion and a love for, but that's not enough. Love isn't enough to be able to commit to and to be able to do the job really effectively. And I think that's why we've seen a lot of people leave the sector, because they can't afford to be in that role anymore, or they've got multiple jobs. I've heard stories of people leaving their roles as early childhood educators, and these are diploma qualified people, are leaving because they can go and clean houses and get more money.
Yeah.
So that's a real issue in itself, that we want to have highly qualified, highly knowledgeable, highly dedicated staff, but we're not paying them that. We're not paying them what they need to be paid to be able to do the role effectively.
Yeah, there's quite a few issues we can discuss around that. And we'll try and take them one step at a time, because there's a few issues there I'd like to bring up. But bringing it back to the safety perspective, one of the interesting points that came out of COVID in the last 2 years was the need for early childhood education for first responders, for the people who keep society going while everyone else is quarantined, for the people who keep us all safe and have to, and they can't work from home. But one of the issues, again, we saw with COVID was the problems with a highly casual workforce. And then this came across a few industries. It was in security, with the hotels, it was with aged care, with the workers, but also the early childhood profession, where people are working 2 or 3 jobs because they can only get certain amount of days or hours here. They still have bills to pay. As you said, it's not a traditionally high paid profession. And so you have people who are literally moving from one job site to another job site to another job site. And if any sort of pandemic is a breakout and they're unaware of infectious state at the time, you have the potential to basically infect a large amount of people, who then literally go home and spread it to their families. And I think we also saw a large amount of staff just basically unavailable. And so we had a great demand, but not much volume of staffing.
I think there are a lot of things that happened that really challenged. And I think part of it is the fact that that funding was cut for early childhood organisations. So family daycare, long daycare, the funding was cut. And so some people could get JobKeeper, and that could supplement some of those funding cuts. But for some people, for example, if you were a family daycare educator, you were only able to charge a certain amount. So basically you were doing all of the same hours of work, but only getting half of the income. And for a lot of people, that's not viable. They can't survive on that. Families weren't attending, so they weren't having the income that they needed, but they still had families that they were trying to support. And it was a really hard time for a lot of people. And I think a lot of early childhood organisations, really struggled in that respect. There was a lot of people who had their hours cut, who because there weren't enough children attending to be able to pay enough of everybody. So, there were a lot of things that happened there. And I think, like the highly casualised workforce, there were a lot of people in early childhood who are casual employees and might be working across different learning communities, or be working part-time because that's what suits their families. And that was a struggle, I think, in itself for some people. They couldn't be guaranteed work. So went out to different places and found work in other ways and haven't returned because they've discovered that actually it's a lot easier. There's a lot more there's a lot less responsibility working in other places than there are, and they get paid more. So they haven't returned to early childhood because it's not viable for them anymore.
Yeah, is that one of the issues for the industry, that it's almost seen as a revolving door type industry, that we get people in, we get them qualified, they get experience, and then they leave?
Oh, I think it depends. And I think it depends on why people have entered the sector in itself in the first place. I think there is a bit of movement that happens for different reasons. It might be family things that are going on. It might be that they're moving to different places, or just, it really does depend. Or what happens is that people enjoy working on the floor and they're really great at what they do, so they get promoted into other management positions or other positions where they're not directly working with children. So I think there's a lot of different factors that come into play around a lot of that.
Okay. Look, as for changing people's perceptions about the profession, I think you'd find there's overwhelming public support for better educated, better trained early childhood educators, so long as they don't have to pay the bill. And that seems to be the crux of the matter to me in Australia, is we want those higher qualifications. We want our children to be better educated. We want them safer at these places where we leave our children. But no one seems willing to pay the bill. And whether it's through higher taxes or whether it's through greater contributions from families, no one seems willing to pay for the quality that's actually required. They would like.
Yeah, and it's a hard one because, and this is, I think, it's been going on for so long that it doesn't, there's so many things that happen, because on the other flip side of that is families can only afford what they can afford.
That's right.
So, families can't afford often to pay more than what they're already paying. So, where does that money come from? And I know in lots of different countries, there's lots of different funding models. So, there's a lot for us to look at that could work. And I know that this government in particular are really advocating for and putting in lots of great policies around affordable early childhood education and care. And I think that's great. One of my questions is probably, why is early childhood kind of in that social category rather than the education category? Why are we seen as kind of more of a social issue and not an educational issue? Because when we're talking about early childhood education and care, we're talking about that it's educating children. It's a teaching profession. It's something that needs to be seen as that rather than, and it's really important for it to be seen as the opportunity for families to have care so they can go to work. And that's a really important part of what we do. But it's also about the fact that we're educating those small minds. We're planting those seeds. What we do in those first 5 years has implications for lifetimes. And you can't have children, doing really well in primary and secondary school and not having a really solid base in early childhood, because that's where a lot of those concepts and pre-mathematics concepts and, all that STEM stuff, that happens from a really early age, from children and playing water play and things. And we know that leads on to concepts of, floating and sinking, and then we learn about gravity, and like there's all of those things that happen that have to start somewhere, and they start in those
Good.
infant rooms. Sorry, and you know that this is my passion, Tom, so you can't expect me not to get excited about that.
That's all right. We will move past the whole culture wars regarding the profession, and we'll move on to some more health-related topics. In your current role, you said you look after the mental health of...
Yeah, so building capacity of mental health knowledge and understanding for educators, so they can really look at the mental health and well-being of themselves, of the families they support, and also the children they're teaching. Because again, if we can put some really solid foundations of mental health knowledge and understanding in those early years, so if we think about a little baby who's just started care and has got separation anxiety, and what strategies we're putting in for them to support that, and thinking about how we're teaching regulation, because we know that regulation needs co-regulation to start with, putting some of those things into effect so that children have a really solid toolbox when they are going into the school setting, but also for their lives.
Yeah.
So if we can teach children really early on about mental health well-being, and that it's really valued and as important as physical health, then they're going to grow up knowing that. And we're going to reduce some of the stigma around mental health issues and conditions that exist in our societies.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. Now, you deal with early childhood educators day-to-day basis. You look after a number of centres across Australia. Can you give an example, non-specific, of some of the issues that are affecting your clients at this time?
Yeah, so there's the main thing is staff shortages at the moment. There's a lot of staff shortages that are happening across the board. So, that people aren't available, or people are sick, or just whatever's happening. And so directors are having to spend more time on the floor, which is great, because I think that's a really important part of that role, to be hands-on and to really know what's happening for educators. But it's meaning that some of those other things aren't being done. So there's kind of that pressure of, I need to be on the floor, but I've also got all this documentation, and I've got all these regulatory requirements that need to happen. So, finding that balance, I think that's a really big thing that's happening. I think, it's really challenging for a lot of learning communities out there.
Are we seeing greater demands on educators these days than they have had in the past?
I think it's always been building. I think there are huge responsibilities for educators and learning communities. And I think there needs to be a lot of regulation. There needs to be all that, the stuff that's in place. How that's dealt with, and the extra things, I think, are really putting a lot of pressure on the workloads of teachers, educators, directors, team members. Yeah.
Okay. In your experience, what are some of the hazards and risks involved in the profession?
Oh, lots. I think if we think about like mental health, it's a very can be a really high stress profession. That if you think about the multitude of decisions that have to be made in a day, the supervision requirements, it's an emotionally, physically, cognitively draining job some days. And you would know that on days where, I get decision fatigue. I would get decision fatigue because I just cannot make another decision, because you've been doing that all day, and really kind of understanding what's happening, and you are always on the ball. You're always having to be there for everybody else, and sometimes it's really hard to fill your own tank. So there's that kind of stuff that goes on. I think there's still a little bit of bullying that can happen in some learning communities. So, it's thinking about those psychosocial hazards of how do we create a really mentally healthy learning community is really something that is more being advocated for. I think that's it's still a challenge, though. I think there's still some challenges because there's still some very old school thinking of that mental health is not as important as physical health. But there's also all those physical risks, the everyday kind of things of, your working environment where there's things all over the floor and, trip hazards and back injuries are huge. So I know that I have a terrible back, and I can guarantee that that's from working in early childhood for so long and lifting and all that stuff. Even though you're lifting all the right ways, it still takes a strain on what you're doing. And so there's that kind of thing. It does take a really high toll on your body. So learning about how to keep your body well and look after it and lift the right way and do all that sort of thing is really huge.
Okay.
There's probably lots more, but those are the ones that come to mind.
How are hazards and risks and safety in general generally managed in an early childhood setting?
So early childhood in itself is highly regulated. We have a very comprehensive act that guides us all the time. And there are many policies and procedures that are in place to support our work. And I think that's really important and needs to happen. I think that there definitely are sometimes policies and procedures that are written by people who aren't living those policies and procedures. So I think that's something that's quite a challenge, in the fact that the people who are living those policies and procedures need to have a say in writing those policies and procedures. I don't think that they can't always be written in a head office and sent down, and that's how it's done. But it's written by people who don't do that work every day. But I think it's also a profession that evolves and adjusts and changes all the time. So, there's always new theories and things coming through. So how we integrate some of those best practices into our role is really important. But there's lots of channels for that to happen.
Okay. So is there any systematic processes in the places you've worked in for identifying hazards in the workplace?
Yeah, well, we have really so any incident that happens in a learning community is documented. So whether that's children, whether that's educators, all of those are documented, and sometimes they are reportable depending on what's happened. And there are, risk assessments that happen for everything, pretty much. We have daily risks checks, environment checks. We do, and I'm thinking, back to when I was running family daycare, all the risk assessments that we had for everything. So I had a risk assessment for going in the car. I had a risk assessment for every park that we went to. I had a risk assessment for our environment. There's all of the usual, floor evacuation plans, and what do we do if there's a flood? What do we do if there's a fire? What do we do if there's a lockdown? What do we do if somebody comes to the door and is not safe? What do we do in those kind of situations? So there's documentation around all of those that's done kind of initially, but should be looked back on and regularly updated and adjusted for anything that's going on and happening and new things that happen. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. Are they regularly gone and reviewed, or are we so busy that there's no chance we can do that? We've already done 12-hour day.
Yeah.
Do we make time for those reviews?
Well, we have to. I think that's really important, and I think anyone who values their work and their teams will be doing that on a regular basis. But it's a bit more challenging when you do have it's not done always in your setting. Sometimes it's a blanket thing that's done for a lot of places, and so you don't have a lot of say in adjusting those and making that work. But that's where you just do your own, and you know what's happening and you know your children, because I think that's another thing that we don't promote enough, is the fact that it's really important for children to learn what feels safe and what doesn't, because without that, knowing what they're capable of and being able to challenge themselves and take those risks, they don't learn what that feels like. So, you know, if you've got a 2-year-old who's challenging themselves on some equipment and you're there and you're supporting them and they can do that and they know what feels safe and they can go, okay, I feel safe doing this. And then they can go, okay, I don't feel safe doing this, but you're giving them that option of kind of going, okay, well, this is where I feel safe. This is okay. This is doesn't. So I'm going to kind of go back a step. If you can kind of really talk children through that and identify that and work around that and work with children in that, and they know that feeling's going to stay with them if it continues, if they're continuing to have that conversation. So what happens at the other end is you don't have a teenager, for example, going in a car with someone who's drunk driving. They're able to understand what feels safe for them and they're confident in saying, this feels safe, I can do this, or this doesn't feel safe, I'm not going to do this, because they've learned that at a really young age.
Okay. You talked about lots of risk assessment, lots of procedures that are put in place, and you talked about they're not actually site specific, they're general, and then you try and adapt them. Is there a danger that the industry, the profession has grown up with layer upon layer upon layer of procedures, and that they effectively become ineffective because we've just got to complete this form, just do this, rather than actually thinking about it?
For sure. I think there's definitely a bit of that, because there is so much paperwork that sometimes, you know, there are those workarounds that happen. But I think that's where, if we have people who are qualified and competent and well experienced and have all the right tools to do their job really well, there's going to be less of that. And I think that's, you know, when we are thinking about, you know, on the day and there's all this stuff going on and there's not enough staff to help to be able to do the role properly because there's lunch breaks or there's people changing nappies and like, which is all the stuff that happens. But if we think about some of those challenges, if we've got enough staff, if we've got all the support, if our team members are really well looked after and looking after themselves and know their boundaries and know what they need to do their job really efficiently and effectively and well, you're going to have less of that, in my opinion. This is all in my opinion.
Okay. Now, in the last couple of years, I know there's been some interesting incidents in the profession that have made media and social media headlines, some of which have led to some pretty unfortunate consequences. Well, that's all we'll say about that bit. But the thing for most parents, and for even myself, who's not involved in the profession, is we look back at this, you know, the outcome of that, and we go, how on earth could those outcomes have occurred? Because we look at it and go, it's a fairly simple process that would have to be followed in this situation. What's your thoughts about it? Do you feel like the ones that have made media attention, do you think that's a matter of procedures not being followed, or do you think it's something else that we can't see because we don't know the full details about what's actually happened?
Yeah, I think it's a case of the later rather than the earlier. Like, I think we don't know because we weren't there, so it's really hard. And I think if we're thinking about in any workplace that things happen, that we need to kind of go back and identify all of the things. Like it's probably not one thing that's happened that's led to that occurrence occurring. It's probably a whole lot of stuff that hasn't happened or is not done in a way that's effective that has caused that to happen. And I think, you know, any good health and safety practice looks at the whole picture rather than just that one part. And I think there are times where things don't happen, but they need to. But yeah, it's hard to know because I wasn't there. But if we think about early childhood educators, we have children's lives in our hands. And it's something that needs to be taken really, really seriously. And that's why part of advocating for our profession is making sure that we have really good systems and regulations that are effective and work in the way that they should, rather than the way that people think they should.
Appropriate.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I always use the thing that you people in your profession help create the future, but that's just me.
Well, I'd agree with you there. Well, because I mean, if you think about, doctors and lawyers, and they've all started somewhere, and sometimes I know I've had experiences where children have shown a real passion for something at a really young age and have gone to explore that in a really amazing way and done really amazing things. And I think that's a really a special thing where I get to see that in hindsight and go, of course that person's doing amazing things because they were doing amazing things there. But every child has that potential, and it's about seeing that potential and really nurturing those potentials. But when you have, you're one person amongst 25 children, that's a real challenge. How can we do all of that? But it's a really tricky one.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned earlier that the profession is governed fairly tightly by some legislation. Besides work health and safety, what other legislation is the profession governed by?
Oh, well, there are the national quality standards that are really important for us to follow and really look into. And there's also the Education and Care Act. So there's, both of those things support each other really beautiful, the regulations and the standards. But, is there enough understanding of, those for every person? Maybe not, but that's...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other piece of legislation which covers all industries around Australia is health and safety legislation.
Yeah.
From your experience and in your opinion, do staff working in the profession have a solid understanding of their legal obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act and regulations?
That's a really tricky one to answer, in the fact that the Health and Safety Act is inherent in the early childhood regulations. And that's, it's underlying and underpinning that. Do people look at the health and safety legislations outside of that? Probably not. But I think it's a really important part of what is happening. I think some organisations are doing it really well. But some organisations probably need to look at it in different ways and embrace it a bit more, I think. But yeah, it really depends on each organisation and what that is. I think I know in previous, like up until probably the role I'm in now, I probably wouldn't have looked at the health and safety regulations and legislation in the Acts. Because I was focused on the early childhood regulations and the early childhood stuff. So that was where I focused my attention, and knowing that there are such stringent regulations and responsibilities and legislation written, didn't feel like I needed to. But there are all of those overarching, like the psychosocial thing, aspects that probably need to be more highlighted and integrated into our everyday practice. That would be, I think everyone would benefit from that.
Okay, excellent. All right. Early childhood profession is one of the few industries, service industries, where there are in place strict ratios for number of staff per number of children. couple of double-barreled questions here. We'll go with it. Is it good for keeping the children safe? And is it good for keeping educators safe as well? We'll start with those ones.
Well, I think there needs to be ratios in place, and I think they're really important. I think if we are looking at how those ratios are sometimes practiced, or if we think about, there's a term called under the roof ratio, where they take over under everyone who's under that roof at that one point, and they can kind of go, okay, well, we've got enough staff for all of the children, and that works. But what happens is, if you're in an infant toddler room and your ratio is 1-4, then that means there should be one educator for all of those children. So if there is someone, for example, changing a nappy or something, we still need to maintain those ratios, because you can't be focused on that one child changing a nappy, and I use that for like toileting or anything like that, and still have, and what happens is one person's doing that, and you've got then the 1-7 with the rest of the children, and that's a risk factor in itself. So thinking about, how people implement those ratios is really important, and how people are supported within their teams to make sure that they are looking at that whole picture. So sometimes you can have a 1-4 ratio, or 1-8 if you're working with toddlers, for example, the 2 to 3 year olds, and think about, what's really needed in that room with those children. I think we need to have those overarching ratios, but sometimes that's not enough, and sometimes we need more people working with those children in that space, simply because of those children and what their requirements are.
Are the ratios just a minimum standard?
Yeah. So you can have more than that.
Yeah.
So you can definitely have more than what, but you can't have less.
Yeah. I was just thinking, when you're talking about, it sounded like flexibility, that the danger is that then we go flexible the other way and we have less, because these are an extraordinary good mob of children.
No matter how wonderful those children are, you still need to meet the minimum requirements of those ratios.
Good. All right. Not much further to go. Recently, there's been some changes in the regulations, safety regulations, which make employers responsible for managing psychosocial risks in the same way they manage physical risks. So, 2 questions. The first one is, what are some of the psychosocial risks you've seen in your profession? We'll start with that one.
If we're thinking about sometimes that burnout, though the workloads can sometimes be huge, and there's a lot of stress, and there's a lot of pressure coming from multiple places, and how that can have a really adverse effect on people's working ability and things. And that can be, we see that a lot of burnout, and and I know that I've worked in learning communities that there has been a lot of bullying happening, and a lot of unfair treatment of staff and team members, and that needs to stop. I think we have a responsibility, and I think when we went to that conference in October, there was one quote that really impacted me a lot, was everybody deserves to go home feeling safe and healthy. And I think there's been workplaces that I've been in where I would have anxiety about going to work, because there was a lot of stuff going on, and that was not okay. And I think that can happen in any workplace, but it should not happen in any workplace.
Yeah. Do you think, just with that, now all parents want their children to leave the care of others in a good state of mind without any harm having come to them? Do you think perhaps parents sometimes expect things that are unachievable in the way that we've set up the profession?
I think, that's where I will advocate for it being seen as a profession rather than an industry, because yes, it is partly that we are providing a service. If you are an educator providing, an education learning community, and people are enrolling their children into your environment and things, but the pressure sometimes for parents is quite huge, in the fact that parents have certain ways that they want their children to be raised, and that's great. Like, that is really fantastic, and I think that's where building that family partnerships is so important, in the fact that we work with families as much as we work with children. We support families as much as we support children, but it can be really hard when a parent, for example, and I see this and hear this all the time, and I've been on both sides and I know how that works. But, for example, a parent wants their child not to sleep, yet that child is falling asleep at the lunch table because they're so exhausted. And you're having to wake them up after half an hour, but that child then is absolutely mortified for the rest of the day and can't cope with what's happening. And if children are tired, they're not going to be able to learn. If a child is overtired, then they're not going to be able to learn all the stuff that can be learned in that environment. So finding that middle ground and creating those win-win situations is sometimes really challenging. And I think that's where it's really important for people to find those right fits for them. So for parents to really kind of look at a lot of learning education models and think about, okay, well, is this going to suit me? Am I better off having a nanny to come into my home, or utilizing family daycare, or going to a long daycare, or looking at Montessori, or because there's a whole range of places that people can go to and find. However, in saying that, there's not always the openings, there's not always the spaces, and we're looking at that, like, people are on waiting lists for 2 years to get to a learning community that they need to go to be able to go to work. So on any way you see it, sometimes there's challenges, but I think we need to embrace more diversity in the education model in early childhood. I think nannies are way underutilized in Australia, because for some families that would be actually the perfect way. If they have 3 children under 5 and 1 in school, if nannies were more well funded and things, that would be a perfect way of being able to access what they need, and more affordable than having 3 children go to full-time care and after school care, and the benefits for that would be seen financially and for their home lives and those children's lives. So I think we need to really embrace all of those different models of care and thinking, and care and education, and think about what works for families, but also what's best for children.
Yeah. All right. Back to the psychosocial.
Oh, sorry. I went off track a little bit there.
That was the second part of the question. Is, now that managers and owners have this responsibility to manage psychosocial risks within the workplace, the same as physical risks, how hard in a care setting, early childhood care setting, is it going to be for them to manage psychosocial risks?
I don't think it's unmanageable at all. I think it's definitely manageable. And there needs to be space for those, for example, directors of learning communities, to have the time to engage and to upskill and to learn more about it and to embrace that, because currently they're so time poor that adding something else can be a real challenge. So I think there needs to be that time and space to be able to delve into it and to really engage with it, in order for it to be really effective and not just another thing that they need to do on top of everything else that they're trying to do.
Okay. On that, just before we go, a couple of little quick questions. Every early childhood educator, as part of the minimum qualification, which I still believe is a Cert 3 early childhood, has to do first aid. Do you think that's appropriate?
I think everybody should do first aid. I think everybody should know how to respond in an emergency situation. Definitely in education. I think, making sure that everyone looking after other people's humans knowing what to do in an emergency is hugely important.
Okay. The follow-up then is, with a new emphasis on psychosocial risks, should it therefore be mandatory that they also have to learn mental health first aid?
I think for some roles, I think it would be great to be able to engage with that. I think, if you think about directors, people, family daycare educators, it should really be something that people could look into. I think it depends on the situation. I think what would be really beneficial is trauma-informed practice and thinking about how to deal with how children and adults and anyone behaves when there is that underlying trauma. So I suppose mental health first aid would support that quite a bit. If you think about educators are sometimes that first line of call for a family or each other in a situation. I don't know enough about probably the mental first aid qualifications to be able to really identify whether it needs to be mandatory or not, but I think it would be really beneficial for some roles.
Yeah, I look, to me, for the directors, senior educators, perhaps, but again, we get back to qualifications matching pay and career and
time,
and it would seem a little problematic.
Yeah.
All right. Finally, if someone wants to know more about the services that your work provide for educators, we'll have a link at the end of the podcast, information that you can do that. Otherwise, thanks very much for your time today, Karina. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.
And I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah, very shortly, I hope.
Thanks for listening to Health and Safety Conversations with Tom Bourne. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week.